And if we're closing the doors, I would like to really start. I would like to welcome you on behalf of UEBT to our 2022 annual conference. It's really fantastic to be all together again after a long pause. And we decided, instead of going to Paris, we decided to come to Grasse all together, have a small, more intimate setting, but also go to the heartland, the traditional heartland of the perfume industry. And it's just fantastic. It takes a little bit of time to get here, but once you're here, it's just fantastic to be here. And with that, I would like to invite Eder Ramos to please say a couple of words on behalf of the UEBT Board of Directors. Eder is the global president of fragrance at Symrise, but welcomes you and addresses you on behalf of the UEBT Board as board president.
Thank you.
Please, Eder.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, first, yesterday I say some things to Bas, but unfortunately he was not here. Bas was the previous UEBT board president, and I would like to thank you for your commitment. You know, all things that you did during these all times that we worked together in the board. It's great that you stay in the board. Yeah, thank you so much, Bas. Thank you. Yeah. I made a nice speech for him yesterday and he was not here, I can imagine. I was like, you know, I am Latino, and my heart is broken, you know. It's a joke. It's a joke. Well, on behalf of UEBT, I would like to welcome you to the 2022 UEBT Annual Conference. As you all know, the world is going through difficult times with significant impact on our industry. I have been in this business for over more than 40 years, but I have never seen anything like this. This really changed times. The unique combination of challenges, difficult to access and transport raw materials, cost increase, geopolitical uncertainty, social unrest, and unprecedented sustainability challenge ahead of us. Climate change, biodiversity, plastic pollution. You will all have heard that the World Wildlife Fund issued its Life in Planet report last week. Global wildlife population have plummeted by 69% on average since 1970. And unfortunately, as I am Latino, in Latin America, the decline of biodiversity was even 94%. It's a really wake-up call for all of us, you know, living this planet. It's crucial that in these difficult times, we as an industry maintain our commitments to sourcing with respect for people and biodiversity, and even need to step up. Many of the challenges we face can only be overcome through more inclusive, transparent, and sustainable practice. It is good to see that the interest in the work of UEBT has grown significantly over the last few years, with companies from all over the world joining. That is a good example today. That's really good to see, you know, the amount of people. Let's use this opportunity and work together among those that share a joint vision, a vision of a world in which all people and the biodiversity thrive. Let's assure our companies, our supply chain don't impact our planet negatively. Let's be sure. Let's work together. Let's see where we can contribute to restoration and create decent livelihood for our sourcing communities. Let's use the conference today to learn from each other, to join forces, to make this planet a living planet. We must eat to ourselves, to our shareholders, and to the future generations. I wish you all an excellent day. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very, very much, Eder, and thank you for this call for action. And I think all of us in the room here very much feel the urgency of what needs to be done, what is ahead of us. And my personal resolve is very much strengthened also by the discussions that we've had yesterday. We had a member exchange yesterday. We are working with many of you in the rooms, both members and non-members. And yes, there are very big problems, but also there are new projects that are being started each day, new journeys that are started towards responsible sourcing. And I really find that motivating, and we do see the impact as well for both the local communities and for biodiversity. But much more needs to be done. And in 2020, so 2 years ago, there started to be a discussion about business and biodiversity. And in that discussion, we as UEBT published the Big Shift report. And the Big Shift report was really taking 10 years of lessons learned from UEBT and share that with policymakers and industry. And this year, we actually decided to create another report, which focuses on botanicals. And this is really because right now, the issue of biodiversity is very, very high on the business agendas. And there is big international discussions around business and biodiversity. There are major initiatives, both at the level of the United Nations, there's business initiatives, and we will talk about that later. But a lot of those initiatives and a lot of the discussion right now is on some of the bigger commodities and the impacts of that. And that is super, super important. But we here are making a case and saying, basically, also look at the botanicals, look at the smaller, more minor ingredients. They may be minor in volume, but they may be minor in hectares, but they are very, very important in terms of contribution to local livelihoods. They come from areas, and we have done kind of a mapping, they come from global biodiversity hotspots. They're really super important, and we need to talk about those, and those ingredients, the botanicals, need to be included in that discussion. So for us, it's really a call for action, not just on you, but also on the general global community to look at botanicals and give those an important space in the discussions. The report, and we are launching it, or it's available from yesterday or today onwards. But the report looks at those global discussions, looks at the targets that the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations, is setting. And that's also something that we're going to be discussing in the first session of the conference today. So we have a first session where we look ahead, we look at the policy framework. Then the report looks at the growing awareness among consumers. And we did again a consumer research this year, seeing the incredible increase of awareness of consumers on the issue of biodiversity. That's something the second panel will be discussing, also trying to understand what it means for business. And then what we did is we went back to all the different assessments that we are doing around the world, with you, with partner organizations, with some of the NGO partners, and we looked at the results of those assessments. And what jumped out were basically three main areas of improvements that are needed across the globe. One is there needs to be an increased awareness of biodiversity at the local level, so the local processing companies, the farmers. The issue of good agricultural practices, and particularly the issue of agrochemicals, really needs to be looked at. And then the third point that we kind of looked at and came out is the issue of the prices for the local producers and the conditions in which they work. So these are the three important parts. You will find it in the report. It's really a call for action from our side that these remain key priority points, and we will be spending the afternoon through 2 sessions on this topic. So with that, I would like to actually start the first session. Before that, I would like to thank our sponsors for supporting us in doing both the research on the consumer awareness, but also on the conference. I would like to thank our UBT team for that's been working very hard to make everything possible. And I really hope we have an interesting discussion. We come together with solutions, innovative solutions, ideally, on how to contribute to this living planet. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to go to the first session. And I would like to invite as the first speaker, I'm going to stay here. Julia Oliva. She actually, most of you know her because she's been working with UBT for 10 years, but has recently, earlier this year, left us to become the head of policy of UNEP-WCMC, which is the World Conservation Monitoring Center. But she's also still working with UBT as external advisor. And we said, you know what, let's take advantage of that. Let's ask Julia, who works, the WCMC is basically the UN think tank around all the issues around biodiversity. So let's ask her to talk about what the new global biodiversity framework has in store for us, and also reflect a little bit on what it means for us as an industry. So with that, Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Morning, everyone. When I left UEBT, a colleague told me, so you're moving to the stratosphere, by which I think he didn't mean Cambridge, but the space between policy and what's happening on the ground. So because I have been asked to talk about policy today, my challenge is how to make sure that I talk about this in a way that makes some sense to the people in this room. And of course, it is important because what's happening in the policy world is framing the work you're doing on the ground. And it's impacting a lot of the terminology, the targets, and the information that you're being asked to work with. So I'm just going to talk a little bit. I was asked to talk about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. You know, all good speakers actually ignore what they're being asked to talk about and talk about what they want to talk about. So I'm actually going to talk about a slightly broader take on the fact that there's an evolving framework that goes beyond this particular document that will be hopefully adopted at the end of the year in Montreal. So I think the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is part of it, but I'm going to talk about some other elements. And what I think is most important for you now is to see what are some of the key trends that we're seeing across these different developments. And I've listed some of them here. One is that when we talk about biodiversity, right now in policy, we're taking it in a much more comprehensive way. By that, I mean that it's being discussed very much together with climate change, very much making the link between the people and nature aspect. And this is really being integrated into laws, regulations, and strategies around the world. You may have seen recently IPBES, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, is talking not only about nature, but the different values that nature has for people, and not just economic, but also talking about cultural, social. So So we're really evolving in the way we talk about biodiversity to reflect many of the things that you have known for many years because you're working with biodiversity, and the link with people seems an obvious thing, but this is now really being integrated. We're talking much more about restoration. We're emphasizing more and more the benefit sharing aspect. So this is a huge debate in the context of the post-2020 framework. And as many of you know, in the context of business and biodiversity, a key concept is around increased traceability, due diligence, monitoring, having the metrics, being able to report on them. So I'll touch upon some of these trends as we go through the different policy discussions and trends beyond policy as well that I'll mention in my presentation today. But let's start with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. The vision is living in harmony with nature by 2050, but there is a set of goals and targets that have a timeline of 2030. Now, the targets are still under discussion, and the way you know this is that when you look at the document, they're entirely in brackets, and not just a couple of brackets, but brackets within brackets within brackets, which means everything still needs to be negotiated among the countries. But what I can tell you now is that there's basically 4 groups of topics that are being discussed and where specific targets will be set. And by targets, I mean, for instance, there's a discussion about what percentage of land should be protected by 2030. And you will have heard this idea of 30 by 30, right? 30% of land should be protected, not just land actually, but by 2030. This is quite a controversial target because, of course, from the indigenous peoples and local community side, the question is, well, what does it mean that you're suddenly just going to protect all this land, and where are we supposed to go? There's also a discussion about whether what we need is just more protected areas or we need more effectively managed protected areas, and what the targets around that should be. But you'll see that it's not just targets about ecosystems. The biodiversity targets are just part of it. There's a lot of targets about how do we ensure that nature meets the needs of people. Benefit sharing is a whole cluster of targets. And there's, of course, a lot of targets around making sure that there are means of implementation. I would say that in the policy world, lack of ambition is never a problem. The problem is much more in terms of making sure that we move towards those ambitions. So a few things to mention here. So I mentioned the fact that we're not just talking about biodiversity. We have targets around climate change, targets around pollution. We're talking about biodiversity in agriculture and other sectors. And there is, of course, a target that specifically focuses on business. So again, this is a policy framework, but it's really looking at across society, and it's talking about a whole of society implementation. But another key element of this framework is this white stripe in the bottom, which is this monitoring framework. So governments are going to be held accountable in a way that they haven't before by having to gather certain information on an annual basis and having to report this to the CBD conference of the parties. So these metrics are still being developed. This is actually one of the things that UNEP-WCMC is involved in, but this is going to change the way that countries talk about biodiversity because they're going to have to really meet very concrete numbers that are expected of them. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what that looks like, because of course we sometimes talk about the biodiversity frameworks, it will be adopted and dang, the world will change. Unfortunately, that's not how it goes. So you won't feel the earth tremble when it's adopted, but what will happen is that countries will, over the next few years, really focus on translating this into the national level. So it's interesting, from the UN, you have UNEP and UNDP, which is the development program of the United Nations, already working with countries to assess what are the gaps between their biodiversity strategies and what's coming out of the framework. And based on those gaps, new strategies, new measures will be taken. The implementation will move forward, and then they will need to, as I mentioned, report back. And of course, there's an opportunity there in the countries in which you're working to engage in those discussions and see how you can contribute to the way that the government is thinking about these issues. Also at the international level, you will see that there's several voluntary platforms to communicate your commitments. I think that's very nice. It's very useful for transparency, but the real work is at the national level when it comes to implementation. All right, moving from the international to the regional. I know many of you are, of course, thinking about this, the EU Green Deal, which is, a commitment and a set of strategies and rules that focus both on climate change and on biodiversity and ecosystem services, very much along this comprehensive approach that I was mentioning about. So on the top side of the page, you will see the various strategies and proposed rules that are part of the Green Deal. Many of these will really impact the way that we are talking about nature in the European context. You'll also note that Europe is actually leading the way in terms of monitoring the way that they work on biodiversity. They've actually set up an entire governance system, so a biodiversity knowledge center to be able to communicate on this. So this is going to change the discourse because of all of the information being now processed and hopefully put to work in the policy world. On the bottom of the page, you have a set of rules and proposed rules that are not strictly part of the EU Green Deal, but are of course framed by these efforts. And of course, here we see many of the trends that I mentioned in one of the earlier slides. So in the middle, of course, we have proposed rules that have huge implications in terms of due diligence and having to have a lot more information in terms of what's happening in your supply chains. And what is interesting there is that we're talking both about rights issues, but also sustainability issues. But these, we see that they cannot be separated. We need to address them in a joint way. And we have, of course, rules on corporate sustainability reporting and the EU taxonomy regulation, which impact how we talk about sustainability and what we're able to say and how we're able to say that. So also a lot of critical developments for business. How many of you know what IPBES is? Raise hands. Okay. See, I told you, Rick, people would know. He was saying, spell it out. I said, no, it's too long. So IPBES is basically the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel, but this one focusing on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And it's been hugely influential in terms of the way that policymakers are talking and thinking about biodiversity. A lot of the terminologies that were developed in this context are just permeating other discussions everywhere. And I see them come up also in business initiatives more and more. And what is interesting is that this year, IPBES is undertaking an assessment focused on business and biodiversity. So a group of experts will be thinking about this and talking about this and launching a high-profile report in the short future. Short or not so short, because of course it is a long process. We're only about in the middle of this snail, let's call it, but it will be hugely influential. It's going to focus on understanding how dependencies and impacts on biodiversity are being measured, and it's going to outline different options for action. So they're really going to be looking at how companies are looking at biodiversity, are talking about biodiversity, and what is good practices. So this is going to, again, be very, very important to consider. Finally, I wanted to mention the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. This is not a policy initiative as such, but I think this is a business-led initiative, but it is also hugely influential, I find, these days in terms of the way we're thinking and talking about biodiversity. So as you may know, this is basically an initiative that's seeking to find a standard way to talk about nature-related financial risks with the idea of helping investors and lenders to make informed decisions about how to engage with companies. I think the reason there's been a lot of discussion, and it's proving it's not a finalized document, but it's really already influential because of the huge need for a standardized way in which companies in which investors understand what companies are doing on biodiversity, but also I think it's very important that it is something that is based and coordinated with other important initiatives, such as the biodiversity disclosure that the Global Reporting Initiative is talking about, and they're also coordinating with the science-based targets for nature work. So this is really setting the standard on how we're thinking a lot about these issues. The focus right now is mostly on disclosure. So disclosure about how companies, have set up their governance in terms of biodiversity, what are their strategies, how they manage risk, but also some interesting guidance about the metrics, how we actually, again, communicate about this. In this room before, or in similar rooms, we've talked a lot about storytelling, but in this context, it's about the numbers. How do we actually say what all of that means? So this is, again, going to be very important to keep in mind. And it's also interesting what you were saying, Rick, in terms of the botanicals and the particular role of botanicals, that how do we, this is one of the comments that this task force often gets, is how do we move from just looking at risks to also looking at opportunities? And how do we not only look at disclosure metrics, but also start looking at response metrics? Because in the end, the risk is that we have a lot of information that we don't act upon, maybe because we spent all our resources on information gathering. So certainly a challenge there. So to finish my presentation, I actually don't have big conclusions, but have more questions in terms of the questions that I think your company probably needs to be thinking about. What does this all mean for us? How do we, given what our supply chains look like, what are the particular challenges and opportunities when we think about due diligence? And I think there are some particular challenges there. I think, though, there's some huge opportunities in terms of the fact that a lot of the things that the policy world is discovering, you've known for a long time. And this connection between people and biodiversity is so clear in the botanical supply chain. So how do you harness that and make it count in this world that's evolving on biodiversity discussions? How do we actually upscale that positive impact that we see in many of the supply chains? But that will be the challenge, to kind of bring together the work that you've been doing and these trends, and how do they find each other and complement each other rather than undermine one another. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Julia. That was very, very clear, and you did manage to translate or to make this relevant for us from the stratosphere a little bit down. And it's interesting to say, because you mentioned EPES, and within UEBT, in our board of directors, we actually have one of the lead authors on the issue of sustainable use and biodiversity, Rachel Weinberg from the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. And indeed, we discussed this issue. So at our level, we do know about it, but we sometimes wonder to what extent the outside world knows about it. But it's great that you all do. And with that, I would like to go to the next presentation. I would like to invite Christine Woda to please join the stage. And Christine will be talking about the importance of botanicals, and she's a consultant, but also an author of several reports, and she will be talking about that. The stage is yours, and I think you want this microphone. Is that correct?
Yes, or maybe here, yeah. So thank you, Rick, and thank you, Mariah. I think my job now is to come down from the stratosphere down to the field level. Yeah, I'm happy to be here today. I have the opportunity to share with you some insights of the study I carried out for the German Development Agency, GIZ. Actually, the focus of the study was to get a better insight from the perspective of the International Development Agency. So what we are doing when we are promoting mainstream agro-commodities compared to promoting sustainability along niche products or botanicals. So the analysis was based on 10 supply chains. And today I would like to show you some or give you some insight about what we found about the relevance of the botanicals for local economies and how these botanicals or niche products are really related to biodiversity conservation, and what's the role of the companies in promoting sustainability. So let's start with the most important topic, which is always the impact on economies. And we found out that the mainstream commodities, of course, they're always present at the macroeconomic level. You have the high numbers in the statistics, but when you're going on the ground, you see that it's quite critical for the producers to deal with these agriculture mainstream commodities, because the prices are set on the world market. So we have this phenomenon of high cycling world market prices. And it's quite challenging for producers in remote areas to compete with farms that are located in better developed areas with a better infrastructure and transport access of roads. So the niche products, they're often invisible because you cannot find them on the trade statistics. So they're not registered, or they're merged together with other products. So nobody talks about it. And there's a, But from the local perspective, they can be really of high relevance, because in remote areas that are still rich in biodiversity, it's nearly impossible to compete with these agriculture mainstream commodities. So the only way out is to make use of biodiversity, and there's no competition because these botanicals do not exist anymore in other regions. Okay, this leads directly to impacts on social sustainability, because the botanicals are often produced by marginalized communities, indigenous communities, or other poor groups. So in the mainstream communities, we find both. There are family farms, or you have larger agriculture or agribusiness. But in common, they are labor and input intensive production systems. So you need initial capital, you need own land. So this can be a barrier to integrate poor people. On contrast, niche products, especially when they're white harvested, you don't need any own capital. Often they are collected from communal land or state forest. So they're just there and people can collect it. So this facilitates really the integration of the poorest. And the further important aspect, as the products are always there and you just have collected, the production activities are reduced to smaller, or it's quite seasonal, that facilitates the organization of family care, child care. So this also helps to integrate women in these activities. And as mentioned, as the botanicals are often used based on traditional knowledge, we have there are high potential to improve the social recognition of marginalized groups and to improve knowledge management of ancestral knowledge. So coming to the impacts on biodiversity, what we are all talking about, well, mainstream communities are one of the main drivers for deforestation. I know this is very general. Of course, they can contribute as well to restoration of agriculture, of degraded land, but I won't go deeper into that point. We are focusing here of niche products. Well done. The niche products, the use of botanicals can be a real motor, a motivation motor for conserving native ecosystems, as long as the people can get benefit of using the species. But it's not that easy that looks like, because the regulation for sustainable use for these niche products, I said they're mainly invisible. Often nobody cares about the proper management, and so regulations are often lax or non-existent. And further, when negotiating fair prices along the supply chains, the cost of a proper management of the use species are often overlooked, because everybody thinks, okay, the trees are already there, so no efforts are done of really maintaining the ecosystem, taking care of a proper regeneration. So in fact, there's a high risk of over-exploitation if nobody or if the companies involved are not taking care about it. So that leads me to the last part of my speech. It's about the role of companies in promoting sustainability. Well, the overall summary can be the company's behavior in niche product or botanical supply chains really matters. We found that in all, it's nothing new to you, I guess, and in all supply chains, they are really characterized by small sectors, what facilitates direct marketing, direct business, and you are able to create, to promote short and transparent supply chains. This means that you have a high potential to negotiate real fair price that are based on an analysis of the production costs that can take as well into account the cost for proper management of biodiversity and other issues. If well done, you can even reduce a transaction cost by having short supply chains with the potential to share more benefits to the producers. Well, what does it mean to invest beyond the supply chain? We find out that niche products are really characterized by a low level of innovation. I'm sharing here with you two pictures that really impressed me. On the left, you can see the production of Candelilla wax done in the Mexican desert, where the plants are put in basins with hot boiling water mixed with sulfuric acid. And this is even done by two children that were very proud that they know already how to handle it. And the other example, it's a picture taken in El Salvador, where the Peru balsam comes from. And you can see there's a guy literally hanging in a tree crown barefoot and putting the tree on fire, at least the bark, to stimulate the flow of the gum. So that means there's really, these are just two examples, yeah, but there's really a large room for you to have a closer look how the products are produced and how what can be done to improve production techniques and to create fair work conditions. As well with the biodiversity conservation, it was said already, we have a huge gap of knowledge. Yeah, the first step, I think it was like assessment of what gaps we have, was mentioned by Mariah. So overall, there's an assumption or the trend to assumption that everything is already fine because we are putting the ecosystem in value. People can harvest something from the ecosystem, so they're going to protect it, but it's not that easy because it's typical that there is no information about the data of regeneration rates or growing rates of the used species. And when management plans are done, they often refer only to the used species and not to the related biodiversity. So here the conclusion is, I think it's important to talk about, it would be good to avoid certification schemes that promote, let's call them like dead rights effects. I'm talking about, I really like organic certification. It makes sense for many products, for agriculture products. But when we are talking about white harvest products from native forest or other ecosystem, organic certification is maybe not the right scheme that really promotes any changes. Yeah, so rather, and it's expensive when we have to see what's the real benefit, what's coming out there. So there's rather the need to contribute to knowledge building and to understand the plant regeneration rates and as well to promote easy to understand and implement biodiversity conservation action plans. So what do you get when you're investing in that? What we found that in all of the supply chains where companies got involved, directly involved, the communities got deeply committed. We also found, probably because of the traceability, increased quality. This is maybe one of the most important aspect from your point of view, but the traceability as well provides a better understanding of any challenges in the production system. This becomes of more and more importance in today's times of climate change. So you can react before the worst case scenario happens. Yeah, with this, I'm gonna stop. And yeah, I'm looking forward to interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine. And I think this was very, very, very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing those insights. And with that, I would like to invite our roundtable participants. So going from left to right, Elisa Aragon is the co-founder and the CEO of Nelixia. If you can please join us. And then Birgit Brander is the head of international quality at Weleda. And then Isabelle Sultan, Chief Sustainability Officer at Parfums Christian Dior. And Thierry Wasser, who is the Master Perfumer at Guerlain. Thank you so much, and we have microphones laying on the table, which we're going to be using. And the idea is really that we're going to have a roundtable discussion. We're going to be mixing both questions from you, from the live stream, because there is a live stream, and I did not recognize the participation of the live stream. I think there's about 100 people listening at distance, and we really would like to engage in an exchange, and I'm going to start it off with a question for you, Isabelle, because you are the Chief Sustainability Officer at Parfums Christian Dior, and I would find it interesting if you can talk a little bit to us from your role that you have as in the company, needing to look at all the sustainability issues, how you look at the trends, the policy framework, how that is evolving, as was just presented. Can you maybe talk a little bit to that?
So hi everyone, very happy to be with you together today. So at Parfums Christian Dior, we want to only leave beauty as a legacy. That's a rallying mission we have been aligning on in the past years, basically building, of course, on the DNA of the house, very linked to flowers, very linked to our dependence on nature. I'm not sure I will be the best one to basically build on the policies, framework and everything, but what I think we are trying to build on is the science. And as you mentioned it in the introduction, we all know we are in the crucial decade for action. We all know basically the last IPCC report is saying it's now or never. Cost of inaction will be much higher than the cost of action. So we are really in this phase of accelerating, and it's starting with very tangible and I would say radical commitment on climate. Before we move to basically speaking about biodiversity, it's important for me to basically shape that the first, let's say, step before we start any conversation or any shaping of the strategy was to do our part on climate, and it's going to be tough. So we committed last year on a 1.5 degrees trajectory, not playing with the scopes, but going radical on scope 1, 2, and 3, with a reduction of minus 46% between 2019 and 2030, full scope in absolute terms. I'm not saying it's going to be like that. It might be like that before we move like that. But this is just to emphasize the fact that everything being linked, we are trying to shape science-based target, science-based trajectory to do our part, to build a bit more on let's say what we can do at our level. When we are saying we want to only leave beauty as a legacy, it's of course not only about climate, but it's also about our link to our agricultural upstream, and it's linked to what we call regenerative cultivation. So of course we're working with you here in our in our 42 gardens and partner gardens around the world. So everywhere we source flowers and raw materials from around the world. These iconic botanicals, as you were mentioning, not the big commodities, but in these 42 gardens and partner gardens, we want to be UEBT certified by 2026. And we want to move to organic but I would say really much more targeting regenerative cultivation practices by 2030. It looks like tomorrow from an agricultural rhythm. And it's about innovating every time, because it's different crops and because there is no like one magical recipe. So that's where we are heading to. Of course, the more there will be clarifications from the policies, the more, let's say, pressure we will have, or clear trajectory we'll have, the better it will be for us companies to set the trajectories and to work in alignment with the rest of the world or the industry.
Yeah, no, and that last point is indeed a very good point. And as UEBT, we're a partner of Business for Nature, where a number of large companies are participating and coming together and actively participating in international negotiations and providing the voice of industry and asking for clear targets where industry can kind of rally behind. So yeah, I don't know if there's any question on this particular point. If there is, please raise your hand. And while we do that, I'm going to go to Elisa, because you are sitting in Guatemala. You're heading a company that is basically working directly with farmers, with wild collectors, with all kind of agricultural ecosystems. How are you looking at everything that is being discussed from your position in the supply chain, not just the international policy framework that's changing, but also the responses then from the brands, the processing companies that you finally supply to?
Thank you. Hi everyone. So thank you, Isabelle, for the insights. And I think it's very important to have our clients and the top putting beginning with the United Nations, putting frameworks and to get the whole value chain to get awareness. Because what I really think that we need to create is this awareness where our buyers and our clients need to know where to look at. Because the thing is that we are at the source and we work all the time with natural ingredients, and we are working with biodiversity, with forests, with wild productions, and we see this all the time. And I think a few of us have been raising our hands, but sometimes we don't feel that there is enough engagement in the whole value chain. So I think this first step of creating framework and creating awareness of our client is the first step, because we need to create a value. We need to give value to biodiversity. And today biodiversity doesn't have not enough value. And I have an example, because we work in Paraguay. We've been working in Gaillac wood. So it's a CITES 2. And this Gaillac wood is, in Paraguay, it's a legal a law to deforestation. So I agree with Eder, like Latin America is being living a thought time, but they're saying, well, Europe and the US, they've been all having the opportunity to develop their countries. So why can't we do deforestation, to do cattle farming and keep developing? So that's why it's so linked to people also, because it's not just, okay, let's stop cutting trees and that's it, because actually there is people that needs to live from that. So it's not that quite like easy to link and to stop doing, you know. So when to get back to Gaillac, so what we try to do is to stop sourcing like all the Gaillac wood coming from change of use of land, and use a forest as a management plan to keep the forest alive as it has to be. But for that, we need to give a value to the forest. And to give a value to the forest, it's important that the landowners understand that the forest has the same value, or even better, a better value, that if we do reforestation for cattle farming, for instance. And I think that it's very important, this argument I have that I really believe inside me, it's very important if my clients see the importance. So if they don't see the importance, I cannot bring this argument to the table. So if we manage to understand the whole value chain, that the land, the forest has a value, I think that's the step at our sourcing level to promote change in biodiversity conservation.
No, that's very, very clear, and it's always inspiring to hear you talk about this. And I know the example that you're giving of Paraguay and the forest management plan you've put in place, and I think indeed that's very, very important. I want to go to maybe to you, Thierry, first, and then we'll come to Birgit. You are a master perfumer. How do you look at these trends, and what do these trends and policy frameworks and objectives affect your day-to-day work as a master perfumer?
Well, I'm going to start by saying the obvious. I think you don't get raw materials for the sake of getting raw material. You buy them from someone. And a lot of my colleagues perfumers, I think we are like 1,000 or 1,500 around the world. A lot of them are in big laboratories creating for brands who outsource the creation. So they have a huge machine behind them of manufacturing and buying departments at Firmenich, Givaudan, EFF, Symrise, etc. We at Guerlain have been functioning by ourselves for almost 200 years. I'm the 5th generation of noses, or they call us. And we do manufacture what we invent. So I have a special bond with creation, that's my job. But also I'm overseeing the manufacturing and the sourcing of ingredients. So for us, because of our size too, we can have a direct link with producers and have the quantity needed for our portfolio. Don't forget that the oldest fragrance we do manufacture is from 1853. So you have to source for making fragrances from the 19th century. And this said, I think we have historical routes. We sourced bergamot for 3 generations with the same family in Reggio Calabria, and for example, and sometimes we have to invent new routes like sandalwood, because it's almost gone out because of overuse in India. So you have to find other source. And I know that here we have a partner from Australia. So when you do have this kind of opportunity, you work in order to sustain a route, because for us it is vital, because sustainability, if you're selfish, it's your own survival, because if your partner die because there is no way to have sandalwood, I'm next on the line because I cannot produce samsara with sandalwood. If I don't sell anything, I close. So sustainability is also not to be too short-sighted and get into this vision. As a perfumer, you are prescribing fragrance raw materials because you do invent the next fragrance. So how do you choose this jasmine instead of that jasmine or another jasmine? That's how we do function. We have different routes in Egypt, in south of France, small. But for example, 10 years ago, because I was at the Givaudan perfumery school with the grower of bergamot in south of Italy, who used, his dad and grandfather was growing jasmine in south of Italy, said, why did you stop? I said, because I had no customer. And that's exactly the niche things that you were talking about. It always amuses me, niche, because it's in French, the dog house, but anyway, a niche thing. So remembering our time 30 years ago at the perfumery school, I said, why don't you grow it back and I'll buy what you do? And you create a fragrance around it. But the problem is that if you create a fragrance with a new raw material and the fragrance, because unfortunately, I know very well about that, you create a fragrance and it's a flop. So you start growing jasmine. You buy jasmine for a fragrance. That fragrance is not performing on the market. What do you do? So that's where you incorporate that jasmine in your blend of jasmine and you continue it to source there. Because there are a lot of people who ask me to, I do a new thing here and it's sustainable, etc. I'm not going to undress Paul to dress John. At the end of the day, you have to be consistent. What we do needs not a concept, but a state of mind. And that's why we approached you and we are member with you, because what we did for almost 2 centuries, I think we did it right, but we couldn't measure that. And you can change when you can measure something.
Yeah, so let me just ask one follow-up question on this, because you have actually been going along on a number of the supply chain assessments with some of our colleagues that are specialized in assessment. What impacted you most?
Well, once again, I'm a very down and basic type of person. There are very smart people gathering today in the room. My only diploma is my driving license. So I'm very focused, down to earth. So I do believe in human relationships. And without that idea, you don't go anywhere. So you have to teach people, CEOs, and the chief bean accounting officers in the companies to express to them what there is ahead of them, an increase in price for the raw materials. Because a lot of people are with a lot of goodwill, willing to jump in the UEBT wagon because it's fair, but there is a cost for that. And this wasn't obvious in going with the auditors from UEBT, that everything has a price. And at the end of the day, you have to be consistent with your thought and accept that there will be an inflation on what you buy. That's what struck me, obviously, but I knew it. But I have to convey that message to the CEOs and the CFOs and et cetera, within the company. You cannot say we want to help locally, et cetera, but it's not free. So get on it. Clear.
So to you, Birgit, because you're as I mentioned, the head of international quality at Weleda. And it would be interesting to see to what extent, and that's maybe a bit my question, so how does this influence or affect your role, but also to what extent does all of this become part of quality? So sustainability as one of the elements of quality, which traditionally it has not necessarily been. Can you say something on that?
Sure. Good morning. My name is Birgit. I come from Weleda. I'm happy to be here today. Just a few words on the background of Weleda. Weleda is 101 years old, and developing health and beauty in harmony with people and nature was in our DNA since these 101 years. And that's why we started working with UEBT, initiated by our international sourcing departments many years ago. And we have an ESS certification since 2018. And like always at Weleda, we were very ambitious. We wanted it to be for all our cosmetic products. Weleda is a producer of pharma products and cosmetic products, and many of these rely on natural ingredients based on plants. So we have essential oils, fatty oils, tinctures, but also fresh and dried herbs that we use. So we started working on the ESS system. We have had some audits already about it and action plans about that. And this topic has now been given to the quality department because it's part of our values and part of our Weleda quality to work towards fair trade and to work towards biodiversity. It's really important for us. And we had many very nice projects in the last years. You don't always have to go to Asia or to South America. We have, for example, Arnica from Romania. This is a small community, a very rural landscape. And there's an initiative, a company there who produces the Arnica in cultivation, but also harvesting in the wild. They are very beautiful meadows, incredibly beautiful, rich in biodiversity, in birds and in insects, and they harvest the Arnica also there. So it's a very nice project for us. You get a very high quality Arnica plant from these regions, but you have to invest into it. You need a supplier who is willing to work towards that, who sees the advantages of doing this work. And the question is, how does biodiversity really develop in the area? How do we measure it? Because one of our colleagues asked the question, how much impact do we have on biodiversity in this region? And it's not easy to answer that. And it's, I think, not easy that it stays like that, because if a community is successful, it wants to grow. And that, what are they going to do to the meadows in the future? Are they going to transfer the meadows into cultivation fields? Or are we going to keep it? That's an interesting topic for us. And this also shows that ambition is nice, but it's really hard work in detail, in everyday work, to work towards that and keep it and make next steps. And what we see at the moment is that the situation becomes even more difficult because due to climate change, many of our suppliers are not able to supply the amount of products that we need. So instead of having one certified suppliers, I now need additional 1 or 2 or 3 others. And then the discussion begins again. Do they want to fill out our questionnaires? Are they willing to receive a UEBT audit and get checked in what they do? And this is, I think, where the stratosphere will hopefully help us, because the Green Deal and also the UN framework will help people to get aware of these needs and what it means for us, for mankind in the future. We have currently 8 billion people living on Earth, and in 20 to 30 years, it will be nearly 10 billion people, and we need to feed them. So we don't want all the biodiversity landscape being turned into agricultural fields. And that's why I think to acknowledge this and to create the awareness in all parts of society is very important. And it's also very important, as we produce consumer products, to transport this to consumers. Because what we realize at the moment also is people were very willing in Europe to buy our products. They are not the cheapest because they have a very high quality. And to some people, it was very important to buy sustainable products based on natural ingredients. But nowadays, with the war in the Ukraine, with climate change, with everything, people are beginning to think, oh, perhaps a less expensive shower would also do. So also the commercial field gets more difficult. So I think it's important to stay ambitious and try to work towards it. But I hope that the stratospheric regulation will help us in many layers in society worldwide.
Yeah, and that's a very, very good point, because of course it is finally the regulations that push up the lower bar, the level playing field for everybody. And that is very, very important. And the other point you mentioned, of course, is giving value to the local ecosystems, giving them a reason to protect it, sustain what Elisa just mentioned. Before I ask additional questions, I really want to give an opportunity, because I can just continue talking to this group. I want to give opportunities to the room or to the live stream to ask a question for the panel to further discuss. Are there any points that you would like to make? This is your opportunity. No? Yes. Please, Alain. Maybe you can stand up and give your name and your affiliation.
Hello, thank you very much, Alain Frix from Biome Consultancy. The name is also Alchemics, but in the case of natural, it's better Biome. I have a question, because I'm very fascinated to hear all the very good explanations, and especially from Elisa on socio-economic support to try to manage, products like Kutsch, or from Thierry about sustainably supporting the buying of consistency, to be there and not undress suppliers. But I have a question regarding regulatory. I did not hear the word, and I think as much as climate change, the regulatory has been a very bad thing for the biodiversity. There is a big constraint from the European Union on a lot of regulatory aspects, starting to look at ingredients of essential oils, paracetamine, myrcene, all these elements, and they say, okay, this one is carcinogenic, this one is this and that. Often, these studies are made on the individual components, mostly looking at the synthetic version, which is often different in reality than the naturals. But the problem is that we are getting more surrounded by an army of regulatory people who try to constrain essential oils. And this is not good because, we talk about the Green Deal, but are you really sure that the Green Deal is going to support our industry? If they are looking also at toxic substances which are in an essential oil. We all know that an essential oil is a living mixture of many chemicals, and they continue to interact together. And often they neutralize the bad stuff. When there is a bad molecule, it is often neutralized. So we see that the rose oil is a positive effect, while it contains methylenol. If methylenol is looked separately, it will be different. What I mean by that is we need to educate. And I think Elisa mentioned the word education. We need to start to really educate the politicians. They understand science to a little degree, but they understand if we start to talk about naturals and forest, a lot of chemicals made by forest, I think we are doing a very poor job at educating politicians.
Thank you very much, Alain. That is indeed a very interesting question. I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that, if that is something you are facing in your own work. You want to say something to that, Thierry?
Why me?
Because you seem to raise your hand.
No, but it's true that as a user of those raw material, we are confronted to regulation, and what Alain said about the rose and methylenol, etc., and they are bad words. Carcinogenic or allergenic or frightening. But it's true that in the nature, you have also very powerful, deadly poisons. It's natural, but that's another topic. It's the public who wants naturality in products. So there is a misunderstanding. Now you want to educate politicians, so I'll let you go for it because their task is huge. But you cannot, any of us, put on the market an unlawful products. So you cope with that. And with the molecular distillation, you can reduce or eventually pull out the myrcene, the methyl-eugenol, etc., etc. So there is a solution. Now you made a shortcut saying that people would prefer to get synthetic material instead of natural. I don't think you can. You didn't say that. Okay, I read your mind wrong, though. But anyway, because it's not the case. But there is always a solution. What I love to hear is the example of arnica. When you have meadows next to it and there is growth, what do you do with that? How do you manage growth? And that's a very valid point into the sustainable agriculture. And that's another topic, but I really wanted to emphasize on that because it hit the spot here.
Yeah, no, indeed, and on the point that Alain was made, because we do a lot of work in herbs and herbal infusions, for example, and there are regulations there about poisonous plants and that they cannot be in herbal infusion and herbal teas. And of course, that's the concentrations that are needed to have a negative impact on your health are extremely high. But the regulation, particularly in Germany and European Union, is very, very strict. And it does mean that you go to find ways to increase agrochemicals to try to address, or you need extremely labor intensive systems. So it goes a little bit against what we're trying to do. So there is this tension that you mentioned is definitely there.
It's true. I mean, to that point, the regulatory body is informed by a scientific committee who looks at the molecule and the danger represented by that molecule or that oil. But they don't make that assessment on the final product dose. And I think it is very important, of course. Yeah.
I would also like to add on this because we use natural essential oils for our product. This is one of our specialties, I would say, what makes us special in cosmetics. And we are facing this topic also, and we have dedicated a lot of internal scientific work, especially in the analytical labs, to look into it, because we found, and if you look at studies of the cosmetic unions for cosmetic products, there is the tendency to ask us to reduce allergens in essential oils. And when in the past we had, let's say, 3 or 5 allergens mentioned on the pack, we are going towards 20 or 30 or whatever allergens being mentioned on pack. And I fully understand that certain substances in a natural essential oils may be critical to a sensitive customer. But in fact, if somebody has a problem with one of the allergens, he or she will probably have it with all others too. So a person who has a very delicate skin will always use products without essential oils. So what is really the added value of putting 20 allergens on a product, in a cosmetic product? It seems to make natural products more dangerous, but in fact it doesn't. If we look at our cosmetovigilance details in the data that we create, there was no increase in numbers of allergies or something like that. So it's a lot of regulation and leads to a lot of work with us for the analytical labs, but also for the suppliers to reduce these ingredients by physical means. But in fact, the world doesn't get really much safer because the people that are meant by this, they really already know about it and they don't use that.
And you want to say something to that, Elisa?
I have something to add, maybe to make an analogy. And I think it's all about education. So I think that we're living in a world that all the risks are becoming fear for the brands, for the consumer, because we're not enough educated. And the analogy I want to make is that now that all those frameworks of biodiversity are coming, our clients might be saying, oh, it's too risky, maybe we should go on biotechnology and innovation, and that's a real risk I see. So I think we have to be, as an industry, to be very careful that these frameworks doesn't put a negative impact on biodiversity at the end. Because if they said, maybe we will do complete conservation and I don't want to touch the forest, then what will happen with all the communities? It will be deforestation in one point or another. So I think it's very important that all the brands understand that, yes, naturals are very difficult to work, but we can, if we do it right, we can conserve biodiversity. And I think we don't have to be afraid. And I'm really concerned about this fear and this risk on our industry, on allergens, on so many topics, and on naturals.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you mentioned the upcoming regulation. Julia mentioned the due diligence regulation. Due diligence is about risk assessment, and our big fear, of course, is that risk assessment leads to disengagement rather to engagement with the producer to solve that. And can you say something to that in addition to the point you wanted to make yourself?
Yeah, sorry. So I just wanted to so very aligned on the fact that there is this épée de Damocles on the head of the perfume industry, linked to the way natural ingredients and molecules are being looked at the moment in the EU sessions. Very aligned on the fact that there is a need for education, and I just wanted to voice maybe a contribution that we are trying to have to shift perceptions. It's not directly linked, but to some hand, it's dropping in my mind. The flowers we are cultivating, or we are sourcing our raw materials from. I mean, for sure, we need to cultivate them in a way that is virtuous from a nature and people perspective, ideally in a regenerative way. But flowers can play a role beyond their fields. And at Parfums Christian Dior, we have a strong belief that there is a possible shift in perception that we can contribute to by demonstrating the fact that the reintroduction of flowers into ecosystems, notably into agricultural ecosystems, can contribute to improve biodiversity, soils health, and communities' livelihood. So I'm saying that because we can be seen as like, you know, flowers are like vulnerable, soft, kind, or dangerous because they go to natural ingredients that contain allergens, But actually, flowering plants are getting extinct twice faster than other species. The ones we have in mind, like 2.5 times faster than insects, 3 times faster than birds, 1.5 times faster than mammals. It's not me saying it, it's IUCN September 2021. And of course, flowers are vital to our activity, okay, but more than that, vital to ecosystems, to soils, to the cycle of water, to the livelihood, to feeding us, all of us, animals, us. So one of the basically work we are initiating, notably with Hectare, that is an agricultural campus at the gates of Paris dedicated to regeneration, is basically running in the coming 12-18 months a proof of concept that will help shape perception on the fact that when you cultivate flowers in the right way, combined with food agriculture, this is very virtuous. Oh, that's what we want to demonstrate, both for biodiversity, soils, and economic resilience for farmers.
Thank you. You didn't respond to my question on risk aversion, and I want to bring this up, but I want to bring up a bigger point, and I've been making this point a number of times. We are talking about flowers, we're talking about arnica, we're talking about ingredients that are, we're talking oftentimes about flagship products, flagship projects, but we all work with hundreds and sometimes thousands of different ingredients. How are we bringing all of those at a higher level and not just the number that we are communicating on, that we do the storytelling on? And those are important, and are important starting points. But if you look at the EU regulation on due diligence, they're asking us to bring the bar up for everything. So how do we do that? And how do we do that without going away from the risky countries, but actually investing in the risky countries? And can we do that alone, or do we need to collaborate more as an industry on that? Have you thoughts about that? And yesterday we had a session amongst our members where we discussed, and of course there's a lot of common challenges that came out, and there's probably not enough pre-competitive collaboration. Anybody wants to say something on this? Elisa.
So we have the EU due diligence coming, and I think my point on the risk is that I think this due diligence is to measure risk, okay? But at my level, I would like not to be a risk, because to manage change, if we want to change things at the source, I think the first thing is being honest. If we're not honest of what's really happening at the source, because I am living there, we won't change a thing. And in the due diligence, I've been seeing questionnaires from so many clients. And the biggest question is like, do you source your ingredient from a deforested area? And if I honestly ask you to ask these questions to all of our suppliers, I'm sure that 99.5% will say no. And I am laughing because it's really not true. So that 0.5 people that will answer yes is just people not that are like not lying, but they have no fear. And I think that at my point of view, and I think that I have a few people in this area that works at the source understand that deforestation, for instance, and child labor even, it's a real thing. That it's not because it's a beautiful rose or a beautiful lavender or anything, that it's not happening there. Even in Guatemala, we have it everywhere with ombrette. It's real thing. And I think that it's, you know, like, it's like the Me Too. If we don't talk openly about these things, we won't change things. So it's not like we need brands saying, please don't source any deforestation, because if this goes to Le Monde, we're all dead. Yeah, maybe. But the thing is that really what's happening is that deforestation is done by people because they need to eat. Okay, so if we really say at the source, I have an issue on deforestation, I can even tell you stories, real stories. That's for me the starting point to say, okay, I have an issue on deforestation. So what can I do? Okay, and I need to open this freely with my clients. But if I am afraid that I will lose my business, we won't talk. So I think it's just being honest on real situations. That's for me the starting point.
I would like to add on this, because I mentioned that we were very ambitious to do the ethical sourcing system for all of our cosmetics product. And we have very many ingredients, and we are trying to get a basic questionnaire and a risk evaluation for all of these suppliers. And this is where the world of compromises starts, because you need something and you want to have a supply chain that has at least a certain transparency. And then you have to think, how far can I go? What is still acceptable and what is not? And what we find that some of our customers, some of our clients are absolutely not interested in doing that. They don't want to fill out additional questionnaires. They don't want to receive UEBT audits. And this is, I think, what will help in the future is to work more together in a kind of network. Sure, we cosmetic companies, we are competitors, but there are certain products that are like commodities for us, even if they are in a niche, where we have the same interests. And then it would be interesting for one of our suppliers to see not only Weleda wants this information, but perhaps also Dior or perhaps all other companies. And then it makes sense for them to work towards this. We've been doing similar things in the pharma industry in the last 20 years, because in the pharma industry, there's a clear regulation and we have to audit and re-audit many of our suppliers very often. So there's a large audit business going on in all pharma companies. And what we did is we closed together to audit communities. So we made audits together, or we asked commercial companies to do audits for us. We gave them our special questions. We got our special answers on certain topics. And then the cost is less and the effect is high. And I think that would be also something that can be done, at least for certain ingredients, working together using this UEBT network. And then it's also good for the suppliers to work towards this direction.
Do you want to comment?
Just a very fair point. I'm not coming from the beauty industry initially. I mean, I've been spending 20 years in the food industry. Of course, I am noticing to which extent this company is linked to like competition and to some level of secret. I agree that it's about collaboration, it's about being more open, and it's about going together the more we can, sharing information on the things that are common, to have some joint progress. So fully aligned, of course, and happy to contribute. What I'm hearing from our purchasing colleagues in some areas, not the one we are speaking today, but is already that there are some initiatives existing where there is some level of sharing on some audits, like with EcoVadis. So there is also some level of sharing on some supply chains that are very sensitive. So honestly, I think we can progress.
And to your point, talking about star ingredients versus the rest of our portfolio, I was mentioning earlier that it's a state of mind. I mean, what we do is not to fuel a communication, it's not a communication tool or a marketing tool, it's a state of mind. And if I have friends here from Comoros Island, Haiti, Sri Lanka, everywhere there are raw material which are not star, it's not the rose, the jasmine and whatever. Well, we're going there, and it's not easy to go there politically or for different reasons. It is not. So of course we have to be sharing information, but you need to be freaking involved, because that's what it is. And you cannot go with a questionnaire and ask people at the end of the world, other end of the world, to fill that questionnaire if it's not appropriate for their own situation. So by going there, you ask the right questions. And sometimes we might be a little arrogant in our approach, saying like, here we go, that's the list of the question, and please do answer. You have to have a little more empathy toward your partners. And once again, you have to buy or have a business relationship with somebody. And if you don't know that somebody, where do you go?
I would like to respond to that, because sure, what we want is to promote the effects on biodiversity, and this is what we are trying to do. And in everyday life, I think it's a mixture. It's a mixture of basic ingredients and a mixture of very special ingredients. So this is also our risk assessment. What is important for us? Where do we go personally, have a close relationship and a partnership and even projects together with suppliers. But I think most big companies will not be able to have this relationship and partnership and even a project with each supplier, because we do not only have the ingredients, we also have the packaging, we have contract manufacturers. So there's a lot of relationships, and it's always check and balance, where do we invest and where do we stay on a let's say, lower level, to be honest, to manage everyday life and to manage also the cost, because none of us has the task to save the world alone. So each of us puts his or her effect of the company into the world and puts the balance. You have to put a Schwerpunkt. What is Schwerpunkt? I don't know. You have to set certain concrete aims and not do the highest top level on all ingredients.
Yeah.
That's everyday life.
So Schwerpunkt is a zwaartepunt in Dutch, but in English, I don't know either. So we're coming to the end of the session. I had wanted to ask you to envisage what the sector would look like in 2050, because we talk about 2050 goals and we don't have enough time for that. But I do think it would be great if we can think about this in the coffee break. We're going to have a coffee break now. So, I'm going to ask you to be back on time in half an hour so that we can start at 11:15 with the next session. I think there is a good understanding where we're going to be going, and that it will have impacts on cost and on prices, that it means partnership with suppliers, but it also means pre-competitive collaboration for a number of the kind of less special ingredients. And let's see, and maybe that's the task for all of you, discuss that in the coffee break, how to do that. Thank you so much for your time.